Goldenaxelegend is a fan-made beat-em-up hack-and-slash game created in the openBOR engine by Pierwolf. It dropped back in 2011 and is more or less a mashup of the three Sega Mega Drive Genesis titles with some significant alterations. For those who don't know, openBOR is an open-source side-scrolling game engine based on the freeware Beats of Rage title released in 2004. There have been thousands of games developed using the engine to varying degrees of quality, but I'll save some of the great ones for future reviews. Today, as the title of this video implies, I'll be focusing primarily on Goldenaxelegend, so let's get into it and see how it stacks up to the original, official entries in the series. The first thing you'll likely notice is how vibrant and large the battlegrounds are here. All of the stages are spacious with a lot of horizontal room to move around in. Things feel a bit different when it comes to controlling up to 4 of the playable protagonists from the console trilogy, as they all move around much more swiftly than before, with a generous amount of new moves, including a reverse attack to get rid of pesky baddies coming up from behind. The days of stiff, clunky gameplay mechanics are in the past, as each character now controls much more fluently, with specials that are easier to pull off, and a few combos tossed into the mix. It's also possible to counter attacks and juggle enemies in the air, which just adds to the pleasant feel of the combat overall. Bottom line, if you ever struggled with the stilted nature of the Golden Axe games, you'll be relieved to find that everything feels a lot more swift and natural here in Legend. Those who enjoyed the original mechanics can be assured that it still very much feels like Golden Axe, only smoother. Everything runs quite well in this engine, but I did experience some consistent slowdown. The good thing is that this only occurred at the end of some of the stages, after I defeated the bosses, and didn't affect gameplay really at all, which is quite impressive considering the sheer amount of enemies on screen at times. Blocking makes a welcomed return from the criminally maligned third Mega Drive Genesis entry, but it's a lot easier to perform here. You'll want to make sure that you're comfortable with all the new moves, because this game isn't messing around when it comes to difficulty. The challenge really ramps up after the second stage, and steadily increases until the end. What's nice is you're finally able to break out of an enemy's stun lock, unlike the original games, by pressing a couple of buttons in tandem. Similarly to Golden Axe 3, enemies will also block. Maybe a bit too often, but they do fall down and reset their patterns when you lose a life, which helps out a lot. Magic drops are pretty generous this time around, but you'll need to be cautious as you will lose all of your accumulated urns upon death, which feels like an unnecessary penalty. The blue bottles from the first game return, as do the books from its sequel. The former fills up a small portion of your magic meter, the latter a larger amount. Each player's stats are shown on the character select screen, and they all handle these special powers differently. For example, Gilius's magic bar fills up a lot slower than, say, Tyrus Flair's, because he is more of a brutish melee warrior. It's more refined than the somewhat confusing system used in the first Golden Axe game. You'll find these pickups as well as health upgrades within chests, barrels, and the like. Beating them out of Orco magicians is a surefire way of nabbing yourself a magic book as well. Similarly to the first and third entries, you'll need to wait until your meter is maxed out before you can perform a screen wipe move, but you should be fine if you just pay attention to your status. You might find that it's a lot harder to conserve your magic in this one, but again, there are more sources to regenerate than ever before. All in all, it feels pretty balanced. Don't be expecting any campfire thievery though. Thankfully, they've decided to omit that tired old golden axe trope here. Instead, the little chipmunk bandits are out in the wild wreaking havoc. Be sure to also give captive villagers a swift strike with your weapons to get a tasty reward as well, and yes, you have to hit them to earn your spoils. Once again, each of the bosses are accompanied by packs of regular enemies. This has been a staple of the series up to this point, but here it just seems cruel, and you won't be able to thin out the herd because they just keep coming. It gets frustrating, especially in the final two stages where the gangs of adversaries are nearly as tough to manage as the big bads themselves. As I've stated time and time again on this channel, it really annoys me to no end when enemies shuffle off screen for long periods of time in these types of games, and the bosses in Legend are among the worst I've experienced when it comes to this. I was actually nervous that my time would run out a few times, because they simply wouldn't man up and stay in bounds. Okay, yes, I was knocking them out of the arena, sure, but even when I tried to keep them in the area, they would find a way of positioning themselves in such a fashion that they would exit the screen. Some are worse than others, with the final encounter being the most egregious example, since he frequently uses screen wipe moves over and over from the dugout. On the positive side, all of the enemies and bosses have life bars, which is a significant improvement, and the heads-up display is easy to read at the bottom of the screen. The layout is very organized and informative, which is nice, especially considering how frantic the gameplay can be at times. You can just sort of look over and know exactly what's going on. Most of the stages are directly lifted from the trilogy, but there are a few that look much better. Environmental hazards have also been included to offer up a bit of variety. Sadly, the majority of these feel underdeveloped and ridiculously unfair, such as these poison geysers and fire traps. A few would have been fine, but once you add enemies to the fold, it gets obnoxious. It feels artificially difficult in these moments, and a means of padding out the game. I'm fine with the falling boulders in some sections since you can clearly tell where they'll drop, but the aforementioned poison and fire grounds can suck on a big, fat sack of venereal diseases. They are truly terrible and feel like they were designed by a different developer altogether, since the majority of the game feels thoughtfully constructed. Maybe someone was having a bad day when they designed these irritating areas, but they really have no right being here as far as I'm concerned. Typically, I don't like to be too harsh when it comes to these fan games, as they are free, independent labors of love, as it were, but I have to call a trough, and these sections can just fuck right off. I've got to say though, the good far outweighs the bad in my opinion. The presentation alone is worth it, with some solid recreations of familiar stages, and a terrifically illustrated opening narrative sequence. In order to expose the true final boss and view the real ending, you'll need to explore all of the game's levels. I was able to manage this by memorizing the paths I took on previous runs, and switching it up on subsequent playthroughs. The game generously autosaves, so it's not all that difficult to complete. It took 3 full journeys through it to see the true ending. As usual, I'm not going to spoil anything here, but Pierwolf seems to know their Golden Axe history, as the final boss includes a nod to series creator Makoto Uchida and one of his earlier games. Finishing the arcade adventure once unlocks a survival mode, which basically pits you up against all of the enemies and bosses one at a time in order to see how far you can make it on one life. The music fits this revamped experience quite well, with some terrific recreations of Yu Takada's iconic score from the arcade original. I couldn't find any concrete information on the soundtrack, but I'm pretty sure it is ripped from the Sega Ages Golden Axe game for the PS2. The option to choose your direction a la Golden Axe 3, as well as some of the newer stage designs, should keep any fan of the series engaged. One path is definitely more challenging than the other, which is a nice touch, but sadly the bosses are largely the same regardless of which way you go, which feels like a bit of a wasted opportunity. Similarly to that third entry, you'll need to press a button in order to hop on a mount, but you won't need to push anything to gather health and magic. The rideable creatures pack a pretty mighty punch this time around, with some new twists. Of course we have the fire-breathing dragon, but introduced in Legend, we now have poison, lightning, and ice-spewing variants, and there are plenty of them scattered throughout stages. They really help to even out the score, and the effects are cool to see, especially the ice breath, which leaves enemies frozen solid for a brief amount of time. These Bizarrians are just lying around this time instead of being ridden by enemies. They are also extremely powerful, and make a lot of the bosses trivial if you play your cards right. That might sound like a complaint, but it isn't, because there's a certain amount of skill required to remain on them, and any advantage is welcome here, especially in the final level, which is basically a boss rush. If you're careless, you'll lose your Bizarrian ride, and this could definitely shift the odds in your enemy's favor. As is the case with most openBOR games, Golden Axe Legend offers up a lot of options to tinker with from the title screen menu. There are leaderboards, graphics, and sound alternatives, as well as controller support inputs. This is an older game, so it unfortunately didn't recognize any of my modern controllers, but a simple joy-to-key button configuration fixed this issue quickly. Each of the characters have unique movesets, and these can be viewed in the extensive How to Play section, which is presented like an instruction manual. Like I said, the presentation here is top-notch all around. I played Golden Axe Legend on a PC, but it's also available for the Sega Dreamcast, which is pretty cool. That console still gets so much support from loyal fans, with tons of new games dropping every year. Quite impressive. Despite my few nitpicks and complaints, I'd say Golden Axe Legend is a great pseudo-sequel to the original trilogy. The nods to the classics are thoughtfully placed, and the added assets are definitely worth checking out for yourself. It's a lot more user-friendly and extremely fun to experiment with all 7 of the playable protagonists. While capturing footage for this review, I had a really tough time putting the controller down to write notes, as I just kept restarting the adventure after each completion over and over. Once you've become acclimated with the controls and each character's special moves, you'll want to keep coming back for more. Golden Axe Legend is damn solid. Next time on this channel, we'll be taking a look at one more game in this series. Until then, be sure to subscribe and check out our other videos.